Hey guys, it's Sandro here, and I'm really excited to finally put out this review looking at 3 newly released heavy cutting compounds this year in the form of Rupes new DA Coarse compound, the Last Cut Plus, and Scholl Concepts S2 Black. As per usual, I'm going to set up a few test panels so you guys can see these compounds in action while I share my experiences with them. But my personal thoughts and conclusions are really going to be based on the dozens of hours I've spent with these compounds, using them with multiple pads, machines and techniques on multiple paints and defects, rather than just a few tests you'll see in this video. I'll talk more about this later, but your technique, your preferential machines, pads and working methods are all going to play a big part in the results and experience you have with these compounds, and perhaps even determine which one is best suited to you personally. Now, the best way to compare compounds to get a better understanding as to how they differ and which specific technique or application plays to their strengths is to test them out side by side on a variety of paints and defects using a variety of methods and techniques, but also by doing your best to be as consistent with each compound for each test, which is what I've tried to do in the footage. What this then allows you to discover is things like what happens when I use more or less product with these compounds, when I use higher or lower machine speeds, more or less pressure, longer or shorter work times, and how do all these variables benefit or disadvantage each specific compound. But it takes a lot of time and testing to really answer these questions rather than just a few quick tests. So as you would have seen, I'm starting here on a hard paint with some sanding scratches on this first test panel. And while I'm doing a test section with each compound, I'm just going to start by discussing the user experience. Firstly, as someone who used the previous version of Rupes Coarse compound, my biggest issue with the user experience was primarily a light layer of film polish residue that was honestly a little difficult to remove even with an IPA wipe down. So I'm really pleased to say that it seems like Rupes has addressed this, and this new compound seems to break down and wipe away so much easier with that previous lingering product haze no longer being an issue. The wipe off itself is actually super easy for a coarse cutting compound without being overly sticky or grippy. And I'd actually say that it's perhaps the easiest one of the 3, but it's not like the other 2 are overly bad in this area if you do find their work time sweet spots. Apart from that, the lubrication is truly fantastic as it helps the pad spin quite freely, but if you do go a little too hard to start with, you can get a little product sling, which I didn't get from the other 2 compounds, but compared to its previous formula, it's also an improvement in that area. Now, I wouldn't say its potential to dust is bad unless you really work it longer than you should, but I would say that it does dust a little more than the other 2, and perhaps a little more than its previous formula. But as a whole, I think its user experience has definitely been improved where it counts most, and Rupes has done a great overall job here, which I don't think anyone can seriously fault. As someone who almost instantly fell in love with the user experience of the Last Cut when I first tried it years ago, I can tell you that the Last Cut Plus definitely doesn't stray from that same forgiving and pleasurable ease of use. In fact, even though this is a heavier cutting version than the original Last Cut, I honestly struggled to spot a difference in its user experience, which is still quite exceptional. The dusting is super low, and even if you do push this compound to its limits, it still tends to resist it, or at least within reason. Its lubrication is really class leading, and I would have to say that it's the best one of the 3 in that area, with great rotational spin on the pads and very little friction that just keeps on going and going pass after pass. Product sling is really non-existent unless you do go a little too hard with a rotary, and the wipe off is just so straightforward with nothing negative to point out, almost being on par with the Rupes compound in that area. So as much as I tried to find something negative, it was just really difficult for me to fault this compound from a user experience perspective. Lastly, Scholl Concepts S2 Black is unquestionably the best user experience the brand has created in a compound since the release of their legendary S20 Black compound almost 5 years ago. I'll be honest in saying that I've been a little underwhelmed with Scholl Concepts in the last couple of years, especially after the release of their detailer-focused EcoFix range, which was more like a slap in the face to detailers, giving them a second-rate range of compounds. But I have to say that after giving this compound the time it deserves to really test it out, I've just been liking it more and more, and they've really nailed the user experience here. Dusting is practically non-existent, and it's easily the least likely to dust of the three compounds here, and even compared to almost any compound or polish on the market today. And as far as its potential to sling or splatter compound, I've had zero issues there, and even on a rotary, I'd actually say that it will sling the least out of the three. So from that and a dusting perspective, it really has to be the cleanest compound here to work with out of the three, but it's not like the other two are messy in the least. Now initially, its lubrication may not feel quite to the same level of the other two compounds, which is more about how well those two compounds are lubricated rather than how bad S2 is by comparison. But what you will find is that it doesn't lose the lubrication it has even after many multiple passes, and its potential work time is perhaps the longest of the three. Now you will notice that the wipe off with S2 Black is a little grippier than the other two compounds, which is perhaps the biggest difference I was able to see from a user experience perspective. But once you get to know this compound, you can actually improve that quite substantially, which I'll talk more about later. But as a whole, Scholl has also done a really great job here. So based on what I've experienced with all three compounds here, it feels as though all the brands have really ensured that the user has a nice experience, but with each of them having their own certain stronger points and no real flaws that will put you off using them. And if this is a sign of what's to come with the user experience of new compounds in the future, I think we're on a great path. Now I realize it's going to be difficult for you guys to see the results clearly on camera on this first white test panel, but I used it because it's one of the hardest paints I have, which makes it a great test panel to evaluate a compound's cutting ability. But looking at all three sections with 1500, 3000 and 4000 grit sanding marks, it's really amazing to see that on this hard paint, all three compounds have almost completely refined even the coarser sanding marks, with just a few scratches remaining around the edges or close to the tape marks. So firstly, focusing here on cutting ability, one thing I can say is that all three compounds can cut and cut extremely well, which is something that's impressed me with each and every one of them. But one thing I also have to say is that no one is going to pick up these three compounds and immediately say one definitely cuts better than the other. And that's just something you're going to see on almost all the test panels here, that their cutting ability is give or take on par with each other. And although on some sections throughout this testing, some did a touch better than others, it's just so close and well within the margin of error based on the user application and random defects on the paint. So then, are they really all the same in relation to cut? The answer is yes and no, or it depends. And while you guys have a look at a second test on this same panel, I'll try to explain why. The best way to put it is that these are three very different compounds that use three different paths to get to the same point. And you can certainly use all of them with very typical or standard techniques to achieve great results quite consistently, which is what I've tried to show on camera. But when you start to understand how these compounds work a little differently, or how you can work them differently to your advantage, that's when you start to really get the most out of them. What I found is that a little restraint goes a long way with Rupes DA Coarse compound. This compound works quick, in fact very quick as far as cut goes, but it will diminish its cutting ability a little quicker than the others. So you're actually better off easing up on pressure, machine speed and overall aggression, so you allow its abrasives to work a little longer and not break down too quick, which in turn gives you the best potential cut and also a nicer and less draining or physical user experience. The thing is that your first couple of passes is where you're really going to get that rapid and effective defect removal, and after that you're just doing your last pass or two to improve the finishing qualities of the paint. But it's important to note that the cut you get is really fantastic and just comes with such ease that it's almost deceptive. You'll also notice that in many cases, once you start to see a little dust appear, it's almost like a way of the compound telling you that you're done and it's time to stop polishing. So this is really a quick working compound that excels with a lighter touch, and although it may not keep on cutting as well as the other two for extended periods, you just can't deny its performance, ease and efficiency. In complete contrast, there seems to be a real advantage in working the Last Cut Plus in a slightly more aggressive manner. meaning higher machine speeds, slightly more pressure, slower arm movements, and so on, which in turn truly seems to pay off, as the cut you can get out of this compound in a single set of prolonged passes is truly impressive and really does seem to play to its advantage. So unlike the other two that do seem to cut more initially, they also seem to lose the majority of their cut a little quicker. Put simply, you don't need to or be afraid to use a little aggression with the last cut plus, as it can certainly benefit your results as long as it's within reason and you don't go overboard. But what's even more impressive is that it can take a little more punishment and even excel with it, because its lubrication and overall formulation is just so phenomenal and forgiving. But if you're not chasing maximum cut, you can certainly ease off a bit and still finish reasonably well. So it's also very adaptive that way. In my experience so far, Scholl S2 Black in some ways really sits in the middle of the two as far as getting the best cut out of it. It certainly doesn't initially cut or break down as quick as the Rupes compound, but it does cut quite effectively for a little longer. And although it won't keep on cutting as effectively as the last cut plus for quite as long, it does seem to initially cut a little more in your first couple of passes. So you don't need to get too aggressive or back off too much either way to get the best cut out of it. Now there is a benefit, or even more so a need, in working it a little longer, but that's really more about achieving a good finish and easier wipe off rather than achieving more cut or defect removal. But overall, I personally found that just a little aggression works well to help this compound effectively cut and break down, bringing it a little closer to the last cut plus in that way. But its cut does come quicker and also fades a little quicker by comparison. The way you can tell that it's time to stop polishing and that it's done its job is that it goes from being quite opaque to translucent and then finally starts to get a little patchy, which is the real sign to look for, as you just won't tend to get any dust from this compound at all. I'll elaborate more on technique with all these compounds, but you will find that the way you like to compound paint may help you decide which one suits you best, as well as determine the actual results you'll achieve. So on to the next test panel, which is more of a medium hardness paint. Whereas you guys have a look at the footage, I'm just going to discuss the one-step or single-stage paint correction capabilities of these compounds, which is all about finding their balance of cut and finishing abilities rather than just their ability to remove defects like in the previous section. So firstly, can you single-stage paint with these compounds? The answer is unquestionably yes. And you just can't take that for granted, as there's so many heavy cutting compounds out on the market that do cut well, but just finish so poorly that they'll never be successful on any paint for a single stage correction. But in saying that, all three of these compounds do have their limitations in that area, meaning that it's going to have to be at least a reasonably hard to medium paint to get a good or acceptable finish. So yes, it's definitely possible on many European paints, but not so much on most Japanese paints. You also have to understand that your pad selection is just as important as the compound, so it's just going to be difficult to use these compounds with some heavy cutting microfiber wool or foam pads and expect a good finish, though it certainly is still possible depending. But used with slightly less aggressive pads and less aggressive techniques, you can certainly achieve a great balance of both cut and finish in a one-step process. In many ways, the Rupes compound is perhaps the optimal choice here as a one-step compound. The thing is that when you single-stage paint, you're perhaps not necessarily chasing the very best cut or finish, but what you are doing is trying to get a good, solid result in a quick and cost-effective way. And there's just no denying that the Rupes compound is the quickest compound here to work with, going from cut to finish very efficiently. So you can get in, get out, and move on to the next section a little quicker than the other two. However, this is where it gets a little interesting. What I personally found is that you don't want to push the Rupes compound beyond working your typical half meter or so section, as both the results and user experience seems to diminish noticeably. But there's just no denying that there's a little more flexibility with the last cut plus that does allow you to push the boundaries a little more and make up a little more time by working slightly larger areas and still obtaining good results. Now when you're chasing a good finish with Scholl S2 Black and needs that extra time to effectively break down, So it's just not going to be quite as quick as the Rupes compound in a single stage process, but its ability to resist dusting and prolonged lubrication also allows you to push it a little more, and also seems to be a little more forgiving in hotter and humid climates. However, its slightly more grippy wipe off may also slow you down a touch compared to the other two. The reason I focused here more on method is because once again, the results you can achieve in relation to each compound's cutting and finishing abilities is yet again within an error of margin and just so close that it's nearly impossible to say that one clearly gets you better results. So the real question is, how do you prefer to work and which one fits you better? The last test in this video was working on a softer paint and discussing the potential finishing abilities of these compounds. One thing you're just going to have to accept is no matter which pad, machine or technique you use, you're just never going to get a perfect finish on a soft and sensitive paint with these or any other heavy cutting compounds on the market. But what you will hopefully see is that you certainly can still get a half decent finish that is surprisingly good if you do use these compounds with a good combination and technique suited to softer paints. As you'll see in the footage, I just did a standard polishing step with all three compounds to start with, and then you'll see that I also did a second test with them where I really limited the amount of compound, reduced my aggression, and even blew out my pads halfway through the cycle in an effort to see which one of these compounds could potentially finish better in the best optimal conditions. Now, I certainly don't recommend you using these compounds in that way because you're just so much better off grabbing a finer polish instead. But just like all the previous footage, it's just here to give you a glimpse, and my real judgment is based on more extensive testing. If I had to pick an overall winner here in relation to the potential to get the best finish as a whole on a wide variety of paints, I would be leaning towards Scholl S2 Black. And that's maybe the only area where I saw one compound do a little better consistently. Now, is it a huge, overwhelming or consistent difference every single time? The answer is no. But as a whole, based on dozens of tests, it was perhaps the one characteristic between them that was a touch more apparent. The thing is that on harder paints, if your technique is on point with each specific compound, you may struggle to see a difference in how well they finish, which for the most part is quite good. On medium paint, it's still relatively close, but again, you may potentially spot a difference. However, when you move on to softer paints, that's when at least I found that for a good 70 to 80% of the time, Scholl S2 Black, at least for me, did seem to have the ability to finish a touch better. So on to conclusions. Firstly, this video ended up being way longer and way more work than I ever anticipated, which is actually why I didn't get to upload a video last week. So I'm just going to try and wrap things up here. It's really easy for me to pick up a poor compound and immediately see that it's rubbish and explain why. But when you pick up three quite exceptional compounds that can all perform at equally high levels, it's just so difficult to separate or distinguish them from one another in a fair and accurate manner that helps the viewer out, which again is why this video ended up being so difficult from my end. You simply can't just say one compound is better than the other, but what you can say is that there is perhaps one compound better suited to you personally, and explaining why that is was no easy task. Now, unlike the other two compounds, Rupes makes a dedicated rotary compound, which will certainly be a better choice for rotary users that will reduce dusting, sling, and give you a better experience and result on a rotary polisher compared to this DA compound. But here's where I stand. If you do tend to use 15 to 9mm dual action polishers, or even smaller throw gear driven polishers, if you work smaller sections and like to move more quickly with shorter polishing sets, I just think you're going to love this compound and it will complement your work style. It can also absolutely work well with larger 21mm throw DA polishers, but you should really ease up a bit on aggression to get the best experience and result with it. And lastly, if you were a fan of Rupes' previous DA Coarse compound, I think you're really going to appreciate just how much better this new version is. If you're someone who primarily uses larger 21 to 15mm DA polishers, or even a rotary user, I think the Last Cut Plus is going to work well with those slightly more aggressive machines. And if you perhaps do have a slightly heavier handed approach and maybe tend to push your compounds to their limit, you may also find a benefit in this compound. Now, does that mean you have to be more heavy handed with it? No, not in the least. But for those of you that are, it's going to be the one that can take a little more abuse. Now, one thing that really amazed me with the Last Cut Plus is that it not only cuts a little better than the original Last Cut, but it quite consistently also finished better for me when testing them out side by side, which I wasn't expecting at all. But then that brings up the question of why would you still use the Last Cut instead of the Last Cut Plus? And should have the Last Cut Plus just replaced it? Maybe I'm missing something, but for me, it just feels like a solid overall improvement on the original version, and that's coming from someone who absolutely loves the original Last Cut. So then, what about Scholl S2 Black? I'm going to firstly say that on a rotary, this was my favourite compound here, and potentially my future favourite rotary compound. With zero sling, extremely low, if not no dusting, and such amazing prolonged lubrication and a great cut with a reasonable finish, that is just such a joy. But then use it with a dual action or gear driven machine and it's almost equally as good. Now there is a need to work it a little longer to adequately break it down and get the best wipe off and finish. But it's actually a much quicker process on a rotary and also on a larger 21mm throw DA. And if you're using microfiber pads, it's also going to speed up that process. Now the other interesting thing is that S2 Black definitely seems to cut better than Scholl S3 Gold, and it unquestionably also finished better with a much nicer user experience. So as a detailer, I just feel it's potentially made S3 Gold, which I've used and loved for many years, kind of obsolete. Now compared to Scholl's Shock to Cut, I'd still say that Shock to Cut perhaps cuts just a touch better, but when it comes to finish, it's just not even close, with Scholl S2 Black just finishing leaps and bounds ahead better than Shock to Cut. I get a lot of questions about compounds and abrasive technology, like what's better, SMAT, DAT, AT, a combination of them, or some new term or technology altogether. The thing is that there's so many factors and components that go into determining how a compound performs, and you really shouldn't just focus on abrasive technology, as it's just a very narrow-minded grasp as to what makes a compound good or bad, or how you should approach it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that no amount of text data is ever going to determine what, how, or why a compound performs well. So using and testing it is what you really should base a compound's characteristics on, rather than a technology or ingredient list. In the end, I just honestly don't know which one of these three compounds I like best, or if I'll change or discover anything new about them, because a few dozen hours is still relatively early days compared to some other compounds I've had thousands of hours with. But one thing I can say is that the bar has been raised, and every new compound that follows will have to step up its game to compete with these three new heavy hitters. As always, I really hope you guys enjoyed and found this video useful. Please share this video, like, comment, and subscribe to this channel to show support for this content. and I'll see you guys soon.